minimum government expenditure in education should be around 4% of GDP. Every manifesto of every political party has that point there, but it has never been raised. We have hardly gone up to, I think the maximum has been around 2.2% of GDP. Right now, we are at 1.7% of GDP.
What is your take on this and the contributions that the private sector has made in education sector?
We have, in some ways, made education a commodity. And like any other commodity, now every quality is being offered in the market by the various providers.
Assalamu alaikum and hello. On New Wave Global, I am Faryal. The shocking analogy that puts into perspective the loss of not educating our children was stated as early as 2011, which was also the year of education in Pakistan, when it was declared that failure to put our children in schools costs us the equivalent of one earthquake a year, with the only difference that this disaster is silent and self-inflicted. The startling revelation was made in the Emergency Education Pakistan Report 2011, launched by the Pakistan Education Task Force. We have the second highest number of out-of-school children in the world and the second lowest literacy rate in South Asia, only after Afghanistan. As the current government wakes up to the reality, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has declared a 4-year education emergency in the country. To make out what this means, I am honored to have here with me academician and researcher, Dr. Faisal Bari. He is the CEO of Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives Ideas, former Dean of the School of Education, and currently serves as the Associate Professor at School of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS. His research in education spans gender representation in textbooks, the use of education technology, role of private sector in education reforms. Dr. Bari, thank you so much for making time for us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
This is a déjà vu moment. We have been here before in 2011, after a report by Pakistan Education Task Force. A similar education emergency initiative was launched under Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani's government. Similarly, in 2016 in Sindh, Chief Minister Murad Ali Shah declared education emergency in the province. Ironically, since education has marched backwards in Sindh, while education poverty has escalated in the country, which goes to show that such decisions alone perhaps cannot be the panacea for our educational ills. Do we have a reason to be optimistic this time around, or expect anything of this 4-year education emergency?
So, I mean, it's interesting you ask that, because the idea of universalizing education, which is that every child should be educated, it's been there in our education policy since 1947. So December 1947 is when we had the first education conference in Pakistan, where the minister made the speech and talked about universalizing primary education and, if possible, middle and high school education. And it has been in every policy since then, but it has never been implemented. Then in 2010, if you remember the 18th constitutional amendment, we added the Article 25A to the Constitution, which is called the right to education, which gives a basic right to education to all children between the ages of 5 and 16. And after that, the next year is when you mentioned the 2011 emergency announcement, but nothing has happened since. As you very rightly pointed out, we have 26.2 million children estimated by Pakistan Institute for Education, government institute, that they are between the ages of 5 and 16 who are out of school. Our quality of education is pathetic, to say the least. Learning poverty is very high. Most of our children do not learn at the grade they are at. In fact, quality adjusted learning outcomes are about half of what they should be in terms of number of years of schooling. So, is there any room for optimism? I mean, there should be a lot of skepticism about such announcements, because what does this announcement mean? What does an emergency mean, right? The government, when the Prime Minister announced this 2, 3 days ago, I think it was Wednesday, they announced any measures that go with it. Now, education is a provincial subject. It is so the federal government can directly only influence the ICT and AJK and Gilgit-Baltistan areas. The rest, which is the 4 big provinces, they have to do it on their own. And it wasn't the case that all these provinces, I mean, the representatives are there, but there was no plan of action that was shared. The other thing, a very good indicator, Faryal, is that I mean, for a long time, UN has been saying that minimum government expenditure in education should be around 4% of GDP. And every successive government has been promising that they will raise education expenditure. Every manifesto of every political party has that point there, but it has never been raised. We have hardly gone up to, I think the maximum has been around 2.2% of GDP. Right now, we are at 1.7% of GDP, right? So, I mean, rhetoric is there, talk is there, but as economists say, talk is cheap. You have to follow it by action. So where are the actions that show that actually education is being prioritized? Emergency, the word emergency means you change the priorities of the government. You want to do something that is bring immediate action to something, right? But here we are so far not seeing any action. If the government does announce anything, then we'll know whether this time it will be different. But if you go by a fairly strong history over the last many years, then a skepticism, I think, makes a lot more sense.
Absolutely. And I was going through our literacy rate, which officially is 62%, but it is being said that after the current census, the actual literacy rate stands at 59.3%. And strangely enough, included in this literacy figure are individuals who can only sign their names, but they are unable to read and write. So that takes us even further, the literacy rate, perhaps the true literacy rate, even further down. When governments change here, all projects, policies, they fall apart. Where there's a dire need for a concise plan that takes all political parties on board with a commitment to continuity, it is something which is not possible. We don't see that happening considering how polarized politics is today. What do you suggest can be done so that policies that are taken under, I mean, doable policies that are taken under the education emergency, they see at least some semblance of continuity and they stand the test of time and political changes? Is that possible?
I have written on this a number of times. My feeling still is that, look, even with a very divided polity, which we've been getting more and more polarized over the years, last 15, 20 years, we've been able to do NFC, the National Finance Commission Award, which was done in the last Zardari, when Zardari Sahab was president. We've also done the 18th Amendment in 2010, which was a huge amendment to the Constitution with over 100, I think, amendments to the Constitution that were packaged together, including the moving education to the provinces and the right to education, etc. So clearly it is possible to work across the political divides on some things at least. Now, education is a kind of subject that is not political in that sense. I mean, it's a political subject very locally, and it's a political subject in terms of curriculum and so on, what do you teach and what not, but it's not political in terms of whether one party wants something different from other in the sort of bulk of things, as in everyone wants all children to be educated, everyone wants the learning outcomes to be better and inequities to be reduced, etc. So I continue
speaking, do they want that? I mean,
that's the rhetoric, right?
At
But
least they appear to
by
want that. Yeah.
yes, by wanting, I mean that that's where nobody disagrees.
Hmm.
Whether they're able to do it or not,
Apparently,
whether
yeah.
they can
Yeah.
change priorities or not is a second thing, right? But nobody is going to disagree to these objectives and say, look, I as a party stand against educating children in Pakistan and so on, right? So given that, it should be possible to form some coalitions, whether at the local level, provincial, and then federal level, to be able to move forward with some policy options for that no government really wants to change when governments change. I really think that it is time to maybe set up a commission. And if you remember the 1959 Sharif Commission, it was one of the most comprehensive reports on the education sector. My feeling is that something like that needs to happen where people from all stakeholders, representatives are brought in the commission, and the commission works out what's the 5 to 10 year plan for achieving this. Look, we can't get 26 million children, and that's almost the population of Canada, give or take of 4 or 5 million, right? We can't get 26 million children into schools overnight. We won't be able to change the quality of education. Pakistan has 250,000 schools. We have more than 2 million teachers. It's a massive system, right? You don't change that kind of a system overnight. But what you can do is you can plan for the next 5 years, 7 years, and say, here's the plan. This is the team that will start implementing it. This is the team that will do monitoring and evaluation and keep changing or adjusting our targets, etc., and keep a high profile sort of oversight over the entire thing. I think that is very badly needed unless there is a society-wide consensus that we want to move in this direction. My feeling is all of these declarations will just remain on paper or will just provide some rhetoric.
Yeah, agreed. So you just mentioned the percentage of GDP that we are spending on education. And recently, Malala Yousafzai asked the government to allocate at least 4% of GDP to education. But then there are experts who point out that Pakistan cannot simply spend its way out of the education crisis, also because according to a Wilson Center report, Wilson Center is a Washington-based think tank. According to their report, about half of the education budget on average goes unspent by the provinces every year. Now, what is this about? Why this unspent? Why aren't these funds fully utilized?
It can't be half because most of the education budget actually goes into salaries, right? And this is true for most areas. Wherever you have education and health, which is very human resource dependent, you have to have teachers and health workers. And so the salary bill is going to be very high. It's
But then
not
we have a lot
surprising.
of ghost teachers who are
I think that the problem of ghost teachers has been fairly resolved by biometrics, etc., in most provinces, except to a certain extent in interior Sindh to a certain extent. Other than that, in Punjab, you won't find many ghost teachers. Then you won't have much absentee. I think technology over the last 10 odd years has changed a lot of those things. So it is true that say Punjab spends about 20% of its budget on education, and the same is true for all other provinces. The bulk of it goes for salaries to teachers. Punjab has about 500,000 teachers. You double that number for the country. That's about the number of teachers that are there in public sector. That's larger than the Pakistan Army. So it's going to obviously have a fairly large salary budget. Now, it is in the development budget that what you're talking about holds true. The development budget for education usually tends to be underspent, and also the priorities can suddenly change when a chief minister or a prime minister announces a new initiative that might or might not be worth pursuing. For example, spending on laptop distribution. Suddenly, the prime minister or chief minister comes up with that comes out of education development budget, and it gets allocated to that. Or the setting up of Danish schools, which are like 100-acre schools, which where you have 100,000 schools or more than 100,000 schools in the public sector. spending 10 times what you spend in your regular school on each child in Danish school just does not make sense to me. And so there are many other projects which can be pet projects of a government or a prime minister, and sometimes they get money from development. The other thing is, because education is lower priority, I mean, I don't think anyone can say education is high priority, because otherwise we would have much more allocation, we would have much more protest by parents, society about the quality of education and so on, but there isn't there. And politicians respond to incentives. If they feel there is no demand for quality education by the public, and they won't get penalized in the polling because of not providing education, they're not going to respond to issues of quality of education or access. And so, because of that, sometimes the development budget for education is used as a parking space, and then during the year, the money is allocated to other areas which might be more high need, or which might be thought to be more high need. So that's why sometimes there's a difference between what is allocated and spent, but this is largely in the development side, not on the recurrent budget side, because there the funds are almost all allocated to salaries.
But we do need more infrastructure and basic amenities. There are schools without water, potable water. There are schools without toilets. There are schools without boundary walls. So obviously, infrastructure needs to be upgraded as well. Now, our education policy had not been updated since the year 2009. If I'm not mistaken, we are still following almost 15-year-old policy. And recently, the Education Ministry has also showed interest in formulating a new education policy, the National Education Policy 2024. What should our expectations be from this new policy?
So this is becoming very interesting now. One reason why we haven't had an education policy after 2009 is because in 2011, we did the 18th Amendment, 2010, sorry, April 2010, we did the 18th Amendment, and so education after that was a provincial subject. And there's a real interesting question to ask, where, what's the point of having a federal education policy where education is completely devolved, and it's actually provincial governments that should have an education policy rather than just the federation, right? Unless there is a very strong either coordination mechanism or an agreeing mechanism that says that if the federation makes a policy, it's going to be upheld or followed or whatever agreed to by Punjab, Sindh, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and Balochistan. That education policy, its ambit is very unclear. It's legal. There is no obviously legal requirement for any of the provinces to buy into the federal policy unless they voluntarily agree to do that, right? So I think this notion of an education policy coming from the federation, I know federation is keen now to do it, but I also feel that they will have to somehow then signal very strongly that what does this policy say about the provinces? Are provinces agreeing to it? Are they part and parcel of this policy? Will this policy be somehow ratified by the provinces or somehow taken up by them? Otherwise, it's, the federation can only really make policy for the 430-40 schools that are in ICT territory or Islamabad territory. Beyond that, they just don't have any legal powers about schooling. But the last part, Faryal, you said, what should we expect? I think we expect more of the same. Education policy will have 15, 16 chapters. Each chapter, it will start from primary education, middle, secondary, girls, this, that. Every chapter you can think of, and all of them say they'll probably say they are a priority and they should be done. This is what used to happen in the older policies. It was a document that would then lie on the shelf and wasn't really ever translated into action plans and into implementation. Otherwise, we wouldn't be where we are today.
So probably it's going to be more of the same. And you just mentioned primary education. We couldn't even manage universal primary education. The 8th Millennium Development Goal was committed to providing universal primary education for all by the year 2015, which of course didn't happen. A little about the role of private sector. You've done a lot of research in private sector education reforms. Millions have benefited from private sector education, and yet it has also helped entrench and exacerbate economic and social inequities in the country. They charge exorbitant fees to bring foreign systems and foreign school certificates. And I'm not against foreign systems if they bring healthy competition and we don't end up sidelining or quashing the local system, which is precisely what has happened here in Pakistan. Metric and intermediate systems, they should have ideally flourished under the influence of these Cambridge and other foreign systems, but that has not happened. It has, in fact, they have been pushed backwards. What is your take on this and the contributions that the private sector has made in education sector?
I think in some ways, this is a bit late to do that, in the sense that as a society, we decided, by we, I mean whoever were people in power in the 80s, decided to open up education sector for private schools to be set up, for private provision to happen. Now, private provision we knew would happen for profit purposes. So we have, in some ways, made education a commodity. And like any other commodity, now every quality is being offered in the market by the various providers. You have the very high luxury end, and you have the very low quality end, which is essentially the public sector or low-fee private schools. And so, I mean, the contribution of the private sector is that they have been able to provide what parents are demanding to a certain extent, and they are able to extract the price for that. As it happens with any other product, whether you want to talk about automobiles or toothpaste or whatever, education has been made a commodity very much like that. Now, to go back to saying that this has created problems also is a hard one, because we at that time also knew that if provision of education happens for profit purposes, then there is going to be a certain amount of entrenchment of inequality, because those who have the money will be able to buy it, and those who don't won't be able to buy it. And the same is true for now health and many other sectors in our society, even security, water, you name it, and a lot of the same thing has happened in those areas as well. So I like you totally agree that it is very hard now to change this. Their contribution is very much there. I think what I feel is that the real role of the public sector was to provide a viable alternative, where if the public sector quality was good enough, then people would think twice about putting their children into private schools. And this is true for many other countries. You can have, other countries have taken different paths, including, say, Sri Lanka, that decided not to allow private education, or Bangladesh, that allowed a lot of non-profit education, to, say, Canada, where you find very little private education, and so on, or US, for that matter, where there is private education, but public education is also at a certain standard. And so it's a real choice for parents whether they want to send their child to a public school, which is free, or to a private school, which is very expensive and might be only marginally better in terms of quality, at least in some areas of US. Now, that kind of choices, I think, are not there because the public sector is not good enough in Pakistan. And so anybody who has any money and will probably take their children out of public sector into the private sector. Now, how do you regulate? I don't think our government is terrible at regulation. They can't even run their own schools. If you ask them to regulate the private sector, they essentially will probably kill them or do a bad job of regulating. Let me just say this. So instead, I mean, recent research is also showing that one of the best ways of improving private sector quality and in some ways regulating them, ensuring they have good education, is to improve the public sector schools in that area. So if you raise the standard of public sector schools, private sector schools will have to raise their standard. Otherwise, why would anyone put their child into the private sector, right? So the solution is still the same. We have to work on private sector schools public sector schools and make them better.
Yeah. So very briefly, if you could just give a comment on the need to narrow the gender literacy gap. As we know, girls' access to education is a fundamental step towards achieving our sustainable development goals as well. How can we narrow this gender gap, and what's the way forward?
So overall, I think it's worth keeping in mind that gender gaps have narrowed over time quite substantially. I think in Punjab, we probably have more girls now in school than boys. But in other provinces, the trend is still the opposite. And so there needs to be work. And there are significant differences by district as well, right? So there are districts that have where gender numbers are looking very good. They're balanced and equal and so on. But in other districts, the gap is still there. So, and we can easily identify areas of the country where gender gaps are very large or significant still, and we can do targeted either income transfers or targeted schooling efforts to bringing those girls into schools so that we can remove gender gap. I don't think it's very hard. It's been done in many other places. It's a simple test for and sort of means tested type of conditional cash transfers. You can do that. You can open more schools for girls. You can provide transport to them, because distance to school is a very, very significant factor in dropout from school, etc. So, and especially for girls. So if you can do 3 or 4 of these things, I think addressing gender gaps is not going to be a very significant policy problem. It will be an implementation problem, because as we've been talking, we are not yet giving the education sector the priority that we need to give it.
Yes. And also the perceptions that investing in girls' education, investing time even in an effort in girls' education does not result in the economic uplift of families, sort of deters parents from sending girls to school. Then this is one of the cultural barriers, I would say. And then there's
I mean, I have worked in Pakistan education for a long time. I personally don't find many parents saying that they will not educate their child. A lot of the times, the reason why they're not educated is either the school is too far, going to school is very difficult, the cost is very high, and so on and so forth. A lot of those factors matter. If you could address those factors, I would be surprised if many parents still held on to the belief that girls should not be educated. I think a lot has changed in Pakistan over the last 20, 30 years. And that is one factor that we are seeing increasingly changing in most urban areas, but in many, many of the rural areas as well.
So we need to upgrade the existing infrastructure, existing schools, improve the learning environment, perhaps digitalize educational institutions, promote distance learning, while of course curbing gender disparity, as you just mentioned, and rural-urban divide. These are ambitious targets, but certainly not impossible. Dr. Faisal Bari, thank you so much for your very beneficial input and for being here. Till next time, Allah Hafiz and goodbye.
Thank you very much.